So we're going to kick things off with someone who is unique, not just because she's a woman in the sciences, but also because she's a woman in a sport that does not have that many women in it. Can you tell us a little bit about how did you get interested in NASCAR? Like, how did this come about? You know, were you just not like sort of a girl who played with Barbies? Like, how did you get onto the car track?
No, I definitely like Barbies. But I'm from New York City, and my parents were actually looking for an activity that their kids could do all together on the weekends and that their girls could do against boys. And racing is one of the few co-ed sports all the way to the top. So I loved it, and I realized, like, in hindsight, part of it was that human-machine interaction. I was a scrawny 10-year-old who was manhandling a go-kart and doing it really well and winning, and I really liked beating the boys, I have to be honest. And so I figured out, okay, I want to do this as a career. And so I started in Formula car racing, which is more a European-based type of racing. And then when I was about 16, realized that, you know, being in the U.S., NASCAR was really the big market, and I ended up really liking that type of racing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so tell us about, because I'm going to venture to guess that not all of us are familiar with NASCAR. So how do you actually get to be a NASCAR driver? Like, what all goes into, like, I really like racing cars, to actually being out there and racing? Right.
So NASCAR is definitely based in the Southeast, so I've moved to North Carolina. And basically, you got to go, just like anyone trying to break into any industry, you have to go meet the people. You know, I met the executives at NASCAR. I knew that I had a very unique story and a unique brand that I would be able to, I think, help with NASCAR and make it more attractive to more people. And then you go and you find people who are willing to, you know, rent out their cars to you, and you learn and you practice. And when I graduated from Stanford and then moved to North Carolina, and it was my first full season out of college. And I was like, all right, this is my time to prove it. And I found a great team owner who was also a great coach, and we ended up winning the championship that year. So it was really, you gotta pound the pavement just like anything else, and like do a lot of reading and meet people.
Wow. And something we were talking about, I mean, one thing I didn't realize is that a lot of being able to be a NASCAR driver is actually kind of being an entrepreneur and trying to get sponsorships. Can you talk a little bit about that process and what some of those challenges are? For sure. So NASCAR is definitely shifting, like most sports are these days. And so now it is more financially based, and it's not that funding alone will make you a successful race car driver, but it's very hard to do it without it. So, you know, for the past 5 or 6 years, I've really been developing a brand. You know, how can I be attractive to these companies that may want to use the NASCAR audience, which is not necessarily the preconceived notions that people have aren't necessarily correct. I mean, it is, you know, technologically very sophisticated, and it's a unique fan base that's incredibly loyal. So how can I position myself and everything that I've done and my championships and who I am as a person and my speaking, how do I then make that attractive to a company? But then also, on the flip side, I still have to be the best race car driver I can be. How do I win on track? How do I, you know, continue to make history that way? So it's a balancing act, but I definitely view myself as an entrepreneur where I'm the product, and, you know, I need to do the marketing, we need to do the fundraising. So it's a lot more complex than it was even, you know, 10 years ago. And what was it like 10 years ago? I think that there was more corporate involvement, more support from the manufacturers to develop young racers, and talent alone took you a lot further. It was still an expensive sport, but there was so much value, and I think the digital times we're in is kind of shifting where NASCAR fits in the spectrum of entertainment, and so it's just different, and so everyone's having to adapt, and yeah. Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, so going back in time a little bit, you graduated from Stanford in 2014, is that right? Okay. And it was a degree in science, technology, and society. I did not triple major there. Yeah, 1 degree, 3 things. So tell us about how you picked that specialty, and also kind of how have you used that degree and those skills in your race car driving? Right. So I went into college knowing that a lot of what I wanted to study, I wanted it to be able to apply back to my racing. And the Science, Technology, and Society program was actually kind of tweaked while I was a sophomore, so it kind of became what it was, which it was very, very science-heavy initially, but then they opened it up to include other requirements that made it a really well-rounded degree. So I focused on a combination of computer science and mechanical engineering design, but then also on communication and on history. And it was really like, how do I take this knowledge and make it help me as I leave the classroom? And it's really cool because you get to dabble in a lot of different things, and from racing you have to be very technically literate, and be able to articulate what you need from the crew chief or the engineer. So it was just really exciting, and I'm glad that they were able to kind of make that major so inclusive of so many different things that need to come together to apply technology and anything in the STEM fields to real life.
So can you give an example of what would you have to communicate to your crew that would use some of these skills that you learned?
Yeah, well, one, just communication in general. How do I succinctly, we talk over the radio, so if I'm on the track and I need them to make a quick change in a pit stop, how do I very succinctly say, all right, when I turn in, the car doesn't want to turn as quickly as I'd like it to. So then being able to use the NASCAR knowledge, like saying it's tight and it's pushing into the corner, how do I articulate that clearly? But then also just having a better understanding of the physics of the car and, what it should feel like. Having a broad picture of how physics works helps with understanding what the feel is like. But then also from less of a technical side, learning how to engage with an audience. How do you engage with a large group of people from a fan perspective? And I was not very good at social media when I started, and I learned that the hard way, and it's just not getting a lot of engagement. So really just taking a 360-degree approach.
How did you get better at social media?
I'm not sure. I'm still working on it, but just being a little more vulnerable and authentic. And I think part of what I've struggled with, which I'm coming to terms with, is, I'm very much an outsider in racing. I'm from New York City, went to college. I'm a woman. So not wanting to break the mold too much but still fit in wasn't working. So once I became comfortable with the fact, all right, I'm very different and I have to own it. Other people probably aren't going to like a lot of parts of that, but I would be lying and being inauthentic if I didn't own that. So it's been challenging. Don't get me wrong. It's been really hard. And I think being a New Yorker is almost one of the harder parts. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just so different. Culturally, it's very different, and how I was raised was very different. But at the end of the day, I'm still a racer, and people still, I'm still a champion. I still have that respect, so that helps. But people in racing interact with women in their day-to-day lives. Not all of them are interacting with New Yorkers and Stanford students. And part of it is also saying, again, all right, I'm still just like you. I might have these labels and you might, categorize me in that way, but proving that they should give me a chance first before they make their judgments has been tough. But I think now I'm starting to establish a bit of a reputation that's hopefully not too bad.
Do any of them think it's cool that someone from New York got interested in this? I don't know. Do any of them see it as sort of a bridge building type thing?
Oh, I think so. And when I say they, it's really tough because you have the teams, you have other drivers, but then you have sponsors that are in the sport, and then you have NASCAR corporate and executives. So it's a big kind of gross generalizations there. Yeah. But I mean, I think it is cool. I think there's, just like in anything, there'll be some people who don't want change, and there'll be some people who are really excited by it. So just got to find those people who are really excited by it.
Yeah. And so were there a lot of other women in your Stanford program?
Yeah, actually, there were a lot. And so the program, it was pretty diverse, and part of it was that it was so broad. But while at Stanford was where I first saw, women kind of dropping out of the STEM fields as they advanced. And I went to a math and science high school, so there was my girlfriends were sticking with it the whole time. So when I started seeing that, part of what I did was do a lot of research as some of the trends and some of the stereotypes that women face and why it is harder for women to stay in some of these technical fields. And that was part of what piqued my interest. Was I saw my super competent friends who were women who were having a hard time, but then I also saw some who were sticking with it and breaking down the barriers. So definitely, as you moved up in some of those classes, you saw it. Women trickle down, but it was really problematic, and seeing how that applies to racing also has been a challenge, and the added factor is that it is financially based sport, so that adds a different component. But I mean, there are tough things. There are a lot of cultural things that are harder for women, and I think having an open conversation like we are right now is really important to just addressing it and figuring out how to deal with it.
What were some of the reasons that the women in your program gave for I guess, discontinuing or switching to other fields?
I think part of it was not so much abilities, but more just the time commitment and where it was leading wasn't exactly where they wanted to go. So people, you grow when you're in college, and some people just shifted. But some of it was, group work was harder for some of my friends, trying to, have that really strong study session. And then other people, again, had an much better time with it. But I think partially feeling like an outsider was still relevant as an issue.
Wow, even at Stanford.
And I can't speak for all of Stanford by any means, but just like some of my friends and acquaintances' experiences.
Okay, so just to shift gears, no pun intended.
I love the puns. Keep them coming.
So what are some of the physical demands of driving? Because I guess I don't think about it as like, you mentioned that you train a lot, but I don't think about it as a very I wouldn't think of it as a very physically demanding sport. But
all right, so we're going to paint the picture of what it's like. Yeah. So imagine you're in this big machine that weighs 3,400 pounds. The motor's right up front, so it's creating all the heat. So it gets to be 130 degrees in the car. You're in your full long sleeve fire-resistant suit and your helmet, which has weight, right? It's a helmet. So, and you are manhandling this machine either on a flat track or like on a banked track against the G-forces for 2 to 4 hours. It's very much an endurance sport, and it's not just sitting and turning left. But what is, right? But what is cool about it is that it is not a bulk strength sport, which means that us smaller people are also able to compete. And so, I think a lot of people don't think about the 100% mental focus that you also need to have while you're 100% physically exerting yourself. And, these are long races, right? And sometimes you'll be by yourself and you need to still stay totally focused and hit those perfect marks and have the perfect lap after lap after lap for 500 laps. Or you're racing against someone and then, you need to make sure they can't get by you. So it's this really exciting combination of mental and physical exertion in a really hot environment. And the average male driver can lose as much as 12 pounds in a race just in sweat. Yeah, I haven't measured myself yet, but I hope I don't lose 12 pounds. But it's a huge exertion. And I think that once people get in a car and they do a driving experience or something and they see that, it's like, whoa, all right, new amount of respect. So trying to convey that message to more people.
And you talked a little bit about how being a woman in this field can be kind of both a blessing and a curse. Can you kind of go into that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So on the one hand, it's really cool because I get a lot of attention, right? I got fourth in my championship last year, and it was the highest finish for a female in the 62-year history of the series, which was awesome, and people liked that. Thank you. But it was also only fourth, right? It wasn't winning. It wasn't the top three. So that kind of stuff is where it's a little bit better. But I think I've realized that going to a new team can sometimes pose its challenges. There isn't a long history of women being successful in racing, and so there might be the assumption that I might not be able to do it. And when you go into a new season and the team doesn't necessarily view you as a winner, they might not put those extra couple of percentages into doing the best that they can. And I've noticed that. I've also noticed that it's really important to have a male ally on the team. My driver coach last year was, he advocated for me. He saw that I could drive really well, and that helped motivate the team. But without him, it doesn't happen as well, despite my resume. And I've been told that the guys race me harder because no one wants to get beat by the girls. So basically, every time I try to pass someone, they're going to make it that much harder and block me that much more. Or if they're trying to get by me, they're more likely to just move me out of the way instead of pass me cleanly. And when you realize that, it's like, wow, I'm proving myself so much more than everyone else. But people don't realize that until they are invested in you and they see that. So it goes back and forth. It's the situation I'm in. But I think recognizing where the obstacles are and kind of vocalizing that, I hope is helpful for other women in the sport, but then also in other fields, recognizing there might be some unnoticed things that might be holding us back a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you guys have questions. We have time for a few questions from the audience. Okay, over here.
Hi. Have you stand up, man? No. Introduce yourself. Yeah, thanks. I got it. It's okay.
Hi, Joan Michelson, Green Connections Radio. I've interviewed Leilani Munter, who is terrific as well, another female race car driver, for those of you who don't know. She has an angle. Her angle, of course, is being, as she calls it, a vegan hippie chick race car driver. And she's been on the Indy circuit, et cetera. So I would imagine you're talking about differentiating yourself to get fundraising, et cetera. I mean, obviously being a woman, and I'm a New Yorker too, so I get it. But do you have an angle? I mean, do you have to, like, her angle is being a vegan hippie chick who only takes sponsors who are related to environmental causes. Do you have that? Do you have to, what's your angle other than being a New York female?
For sure. So I think it's kind of twofold. One is that emphasizing the STEM aspect. I think, people think of Formula One as a really technologically advanced sport and then may not think of NASCAR as the same way. And so really trying to bridge those connections, and especially bridging like Silicon Valley and modern technologies and where everything's going there, and trying to bridge that with NASCAR. That's a really interesting connection that I've been trying to build up more, which is a slow process, but the tech angle is huge. And the more general women's empowerment. I think the women in the sport have taken very different approaches. Some people don't like talking about being a woman and being different, but I think it's so important, and I think it's really cool to share different stories. So emphasizing that, I think the women's part is a big part, 'cause it's still not being talked about. Like, you don't see, even though NASCAR has a 40% female fan base, you don't see a lot of women's products in there, which NASCAR has some of the most brand loyal fans out there in any sport. And so kind of bringing that to the surface is really important to me, because there's a whole lot of really cool products out there that are geared towards women, and then things that can, again, from the technology side, that can benefit the sport as a whole. That B2B angle is really interesting. Yeah.
I think there's,
Sure. My name is Kathleen Linehan, and I work for CH2M Hill, which is an architectural and engineering firm. I'm fascinated by your story, and I think it's one of the coolest applications of sort of a young woman who was, sort of naturally inclined toward technical issues. So kudos to you for living through that. I know nothing about car racing in general, and I'm curious, are the other NASCAR drivers scientists and engineers?
Yeah. Good question. Paul Newman, at the top level in the Cup Series, he has an engineering degree from Purdue. Not more of the younger guys are going to college, and even though they might not have the official, college education, you can't be stupid and racing a car, and you can't. I mean, it's true. You got a lot of inputs coming in at really high speeds with walls right there, so you can't be. You got to be able to take that. But yeah, I mean, these guys, a lot of them know the mechanics of the car, and they know, like, there are plenty of drivers who know more about the car and, like, specifically what changes how you turn things, like, certain ways and what parts you can change out. I'm pretty competent on that end. But yeah, I mean, the better understanding you have of the mechanics of the car and what different changes will make on track and how your driving style will change how the car responds, the better race car driver you are. So for the most part, everyone is very smart, and a lot of the crew chiefs and the engineers and the mechanics on the team, again, they might not have the formal education, but they're all very competent on the engineering spectrum. Yeah, great question though.
Lee Zia from the National Science Foundation. You mentioned, you alluded to group work being challenging or difficult. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so, and I experienced this a little bit, not as much on my technical classes, but when my friends and I would talk, sometimes there was the, like, allocation of work and allocation. And again, this was not everywhere, this was not with every class and every group, but for some of the, some things that were more involved or more challenging, a lot of times when it came to delegating working groups, like sometimes the guys got more of that stuff and some of the women got, fluffier work, for lack of a better word. So I think that was one thing. I think also, that was really the big one, just like where the delegation of work went, or jumping in and taking over a little more quickly. And again, this is just personal experiences that my friends and I have had, but being able to have that strong voice to stand up, like, say, hey, I'm going to do this job, like, I can do this job. And it's the same thing, getting the respect from the team right away. Like, all right, if they don't expect that I can do it, they're not going to give me the chance.
Just ask a quick follow-up. So does it have something to do with the distribution within the group? Like, is the group primarily males because of the nature of the course?
Yeah, Yeah, the question was, is a group primarily males? Honestly, no. I think it was more equal, and obviously personalities are going to come in, right? But I'll be honest, I didn't do a ton of group work in college, so my data pool is a little bit smaller. But yeah, in those personal experiences, it's just, and if you want to get things done efficiently, if you feel like you can do it faster, you might insert yourself to do that. So.
Yeah, and there's also the secretary effect and all sorts of other things that happen in group dynamics. Well, thank you so much, Julia, for working on these issues, and hopefully we have a couple dozen new NASCAR fans.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you
for
guys.
having us. Thank you.